Hello. I was just taking some photos of Kanata. But while you're here, why don't I help you out with some tips on how you can take better photos of your doll too? So photography can have a lot of nuances, and instead of trying to cover everything in just one video, I'm going to break it up. So I'm going to make a series for you. So for the very first episode of this series, I'm going to be focused on lighting because I think that's probably one of the most important things that people overlook when they're taking photos, right? We're not going to focus so much on like posing and setting them up and sort of backgrounds and things like that. We're just going to be focused on lighting because the most important thing we do when we want to get good doll photos is highlight those features, and specifically when you have a subject that models after a human, right? You want their face to pop and really stand out and just be bright and beautiful as much as possible. And just so you guys have an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to talk about some rules first that we want to just kind of keep in the back of our mind. Then we'll talk about taking photos indoors versus outdoors and how those kind of things differ. And then we're also going to end with tools that you can use, some that are more expensive and some that are very cheap, so that anybody can get started taking better photos faster. So one thing I really want to mention before we get too far into it is that you want to strive as much as possible to get the perfect photo that you want in your camera or in your phone, right, when you take that picture. There is a lot of stuff that you can do in like applications and like photo editing on your phone or on your computer, but you want to strive to try to get the best picture possible in camera of your doll or your subject when you take that photo, because after you take that photo, you don't get to go back and like recreate those settings perfectly. So just try to get the most perfect photo you can, right? The best light, the best position and everything like that in your camera the moment you take it. Because even though those apps can help you, and even though there's things like Photoshop, which if you're advanced, using that too, you can make it look really good or like there were different circumstances. But in general, it's just going to be easiest on you to try to get the best photo right off the bat. All right, rule number one, we always want to strive for soft light. And basically what that means is we don't want a hard direct light on our subject anytime that we can avoid it. Sometimes you need light like in dark circumstances, right? Like late at night or in a dark room. You'll have some kind of light that may end up being direct, but as much as possible, we want to strive for a soft light. And what that kind of means is a light that is not directly on your subject, creating these like harsh shadows, right? This like harsh contrast of brights and darks just right up against each other, right? We want it to sort of have a nice even tone across the whole subject. I'll get into more specifics on how you do that indoor versus outdoor in just a second, but in general, just avoid any direct lights as much as possible. Like I've got this flashlight here, right, and I'm sort of shining it on her. This is kind of the soft light look, right? This is the hard light look. You don't want this. As much as possible, you don't want this. So rule number two, we want to have a like pop of light on the face if we can. So in this room right here, I've got a couple windows open and I've got a light on right here that's kind of creating a generally soft light. But if you look at like this background, and ignore the green, I know it's terrible, but if you look at this background and you look at her, right, it's kind of it's even in terms of light, right? Nothing's too bright, nothing's too dark, hopefully. But her face doesn't really stand out, right? And especially when we're going to want to be highlighting our subject, we want them to stand out a little bit. So in order to get that like pop of light for the face, you're going to have to use a couple of tricks. You can either use like another light source, and I know I just said not to use a flashlight. You don't want to do that. But you want to use a different light source, or you want to use reflection or something like that in order to make the subject's face at least, if you're not trying to highlight the whole body, at least highlight the subject's face just a little bit more from the background, right? So we have this even light between the background and the subject. We want to make sure that Kanata's standing out a little bit. So really quick, I'll show you what you do. So we want Kanata to pop out just a little bit more from the background, and there's a couple ways to do that, right? You're going to use like an external light, like a static light, something similar to this. I know I just said don't use a direct light, but if you have a fancy soft light that you can use, you could put that on your subject, and already you can see she's obviously separated from the background. The other thing I mentioned was reflection. So one way to do that is And this is just a plain like white board. We'll talk more about tools at the very end. But with reflection, you want to catch light either like below or on the side of your subject, right? And sort of you bounce it back up at them so that all this like ambient light that's sort of floating around, right? We're gonna catch a little bit of it using the board and put it back, bounce it back up on her and on her face. If you're taking photos, this can be difficult because you're not gonna do this. You might need another person, or you might just set like some rocks or something like that below your reflector, and that'll help out a lot too. I don't know if you can really tell in the video, but it should be bouncing a little bit more light up on her face, especially because I have a really bright window right there. So we mentioned light, we mentioned the reflector. The other way you can do that is with a flash and things like that. That's kind of a light though, so that's sort of cheaty. The other way you can do that is sort of differentiate your background by making that like negative, making it darker instead of making her brighter, right? So we can find maybe like a more shaded spot that we might put her, or just use more light from the window while making the background a little bit darker. Or we might try moving ourselves around with the camera so that we can make her background a little bit darker, maybe move her so that the background isn't as close to whatever light source we're using, while still keeping her focused, sort of looking towards the window or whatever our light source is, right? And outside, if you're putting them in the shade, right, maybe the background's in the shade, but maybe your doll's sort of more out in front in the light, and that'll really make her stand out as well. All right, so part 3, let's talk about indoor rules. Now, keep in mind, none of these things are like hard rules that you have to follow. If you feel really creative doing something that is sort of against the rules or breaking the rules, do it. If you think the photo looks interesting, take that photo. Don't listen to me. But in general, these are some good tips for getting better photos inside. So going back to our first rule of getting soft light, no matter where you are, indoors, that's really easy to get because outside of this studio light over here, I've got these 2 windows and the light's coming through, but it's just sort of bouncing around and it's making that soft light on Kanata, right? There's no hard light on her and it looks good. So right off the bat, indoors, you're off to a good start. You've got ambient light and it's soft. So the second tip for taking photos indoors is windows. Don't place your doll directly in front of a window. Now I know if you're going for something artistic or you know what you're doing, then absolutely. But in general, the window is basically going to be like a giant flashlight right in front of your doll. So real quick, pretend this is our window, right? If you place your doll in front of the window and then you're sort of taking photos like this, you're going to get that really hard light, which can be like dramatic as well. So if you're being creative, that's okay. Roll with that. But it's going to give a really hard light on top of your doll. And if your camera is exposing for the face, the background might just disappear completely. So again, this isn't bad, but in general, putting your doll in front of a window like this is going to be like just shining a flashlight directly on their face. It's not going to look great. So similar to that, posing them right up against the window this way is also kind of a bad idea. Again, unless you know what you're doing or you're compensating by just blasting their face with light to match the window behind them, you don't want to do this either. Because when you're taking that photo, your camera is going to adjust to this really bright light source behind them, and it's going to create what I call like the God effect, and you won't be able to see your subject. They'll just have this like blackened silhouette. Meanwhile, the light is just like blasting out from behind them, right? Like just radiating. You're not going to even be able to see their features. But again, if you're being creative, do what you do. So maybe you already take really good photos during the day inside your house, but you're wondering how to get better photos at night, right? So this is when it becomes tricky. There were a couple photos that I took last year, I think, around Thanksgiving or Christmas, and they were taken at night. And obviously we don't have this nice ambient light coming in because it's nighttime. So you have to use artificial lights. You're going to have to use your lamps and things like that. So this can be a little tricky because, again, we don't want like a hard direct light on them, but you'll find when you're taking your photo that it looks really grainy and it's super dark. So what do we do about that, right? And I guess the trick that you do is you use a combination of things. One of them I'll mention in the tools, but if you don't want to buy anything extra, you kind of just use your walls to bounce any light you have in order to create that ambient light that isn't there. So here's an example of what I did when I took those photos that I was just talking about. I kind of sat back with a lamp on my shoulder, and at first I experimented with like pointing it at her, and then I pointed it at the wall, the wall that she was facing, and then I pointed it at the floor. And I think really one of those things is just experiment with it. If you don't have the perfect tools, and I don't even have all the tools that a pro photographer would be using, but just experiment with the light sources that you have. Maybe add 2 lamps. Maybe have a floor lamp that's pushing light into the ceiling and sort of bouncing it around, while you have a more direct light, maybe a small lamp that you can position and you can try shining it on them, as well as maybe shining it from the side or just bouncing it off the wall while they're looking at the wall too. So in general, at night when you're indoors, and if you're just working with what you have around the house, just try using some lamps to first, sort of boost that illumination around the room. And then if you find that you still haven't gotten that like pop of light for the face like we talked about, then try finding another lamp that you can use. And if you're like really on a budget, or you really just want to use what's in your house, take a lamp and then take a piece of like thin like parchment paper, or not so much like a wax paper, but like a parchment paper, a really like opaque white kind of paper. Just put that in front of your lamp. It'll soften the light immediately, and you'll still be able to get that pop of light for the face. It'll look good. But most importantly, just experiment with things. At night, it's much more difficult to take photos, and it's going to be a little bit harder, to make your doll have that perfect lit up face like you'd easily get during the day. Alright, so part 4, we're going to talk about taking photos outside. This is going to be a lot more difficult than taking photos just inside, because right off the bat, we don't have this nice ambient light that's just sort of like illuminating everything and giving us that soft light. Mainly because you have to deal with the sun, which is a dynamic light source moving across the sky like a giant flashlight on your doll, right? So how do we deal with that? So my first tip for taking good photos outside of either dolls or people is taking them during what's called golden hour. So maybe you've heard of this, but golden hour technically happens 2 times a day. It happens really early in the morning, and it happens late at night. So usually most people probably notice it during the sunset. The sun's pretty bright. It's generally white though all day. But towards dusk, as it starts setting, right, all of a sudden the light that you'll see, just everywhere, or on the side of your house or whatever, it becomes orangey, it becomes golden, right? It produces a really nice sort of glow. So instead of being bright white like it is all day, when it's setting, it tends to create this golden color. So they call it golden hour because it only lasts about an hour, but it happens in the morning when the sun is coming up, and it happens at night when the sun is going down. So if you want to get up really early, or save taking photos for the end of the day, you can get these really nice photos of your doll, not just nicely illuminated, right, but they'll have this like really nice glow. And I don't really have like good descriptors for what that glow is called, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Like if you look at like senior photos of people like sitting in a field of like wheat or something, I mean, people do that, right? It has that nice orangey glow to it. And sometimes on your phone, maybe some of you are used to like adding filters and things like that. There's a like warmify or warm slider that you can use. That sort of simulates what this like golden hour look will give to your doll in your photos. But let's pretend that you're lazy, or that you just work really hard and you need as much sleep as you can get, right? So if you can't take photos during golden hour, what are you supposed to do? Once the sun gets past that little band of golden hour in the morning, and while it's sort of, casting all day into the night before dusk, right? When and how do you take pictures during that time period, right? Because it's just a giant flashlight. If you go outside with your doll, like I said, and just put it, out in direct sun and try and take a photo, you're going to get really harsh shadows. It's not going to look very good. So the first tip for dealing with that is just trying to I like finding like shaded spots, right? So try and find a shaded spot. See if you can put them, in like the shade of a tree or in the shade of a building. And that'll create that nice, like even soft light like we talked about. And you might say, well, it's kind of dark, Justin, or it's kind of blue. And we'll talk about that in like the tools and other tips section. But in general, putting them in the shade outside is one of the first things that you can do to get away from that harsh direct light, right? We just want a soft light across our subject and across the background. But if you decided that you didn't want to use the shade trick, or you're just not able to use it, right? Maybe you're just out in the city and you decided this is a nice place, I want to take this photo here. There's two things that you can use. The first being a flash, if you have one. And the flash is just going to, right at your subject, right, it's just going to fill all those shadows down here that the sun up top is creating, right? The sun's going to be creating these really harsh shadows on your subject. Taking a photo with the flash is just going to illuminate and fill all those things, and it's going to just make your subject not only pop out, but just look better. It's going to remove all those harsh, really bright areas to really dark areas. So that's the first thing that you can do. The second thing that you can do is use what's called a diffuser. And a diffuser basically makes hard light soft. So similar to the video where I used an umbrella behind me to block light on Canada, that still created that like shadowy effect, right? Which if you're outside and you have something like this, maybe there's enough ambient light that it won't actually create much of a shadow, but you can put it over your subject like this, kind of similar to how I use the umbrella. But if there isn't enough ambient light, it's going to create a shadow. So the diffuser, instead of being a completely opaque thing like this board here, it's actually kind of like a little screen, and it's going to break up and let the light through, just not directly. It sort of softens it and spreads it around. So your subject will still be lit up. If anything, it'll be slightly darker, but the diffuser will break that light up and spread it around so that you'll get soft light on them. They'll look good, like you're taking photos indoors, and you won't get those like harsh shadows from the sun or like a flashlight. There are probably a lot of other tricks that you can use while you're taking photos outside, but in general, those are the two that I've used consistently. Trying to put them in a shady spot, right, where you still get enough like illumination from the daytime, but not like direct light. And then if you want them to be in direct light, is using a couple of tools, right? You can use a diffuser or a flash. Those are the two that I think are probably going to be most helpful for most people. There may be some other tricks. If there are, feel free to put them down below and help everybody else out. But in general, taking photos outdoors, that's probably going to be your best bet. And finally, let's just talk about tools that I use and that you can use too. So we've kind of covered a little bit of them while we talked about the other areas, but we'll just break it down what they are and what their purpose is and whether I think they're helpful, and we'll talk about their price too. So the first thing for taking photos indoors is like a studio light, and this is super beneficial. A lot of people will use like a ring light because they've seen like beauty gurus or people that do a lot of like webcam stuff use that ring light, and those are good too. That I would count that as like a studio light. Usually those are diffused as well, so they'll also create a soft light on your subject. So those are good if you want to. I don't use one, but I think it would work just as fine as my studio light. So my studio light is basically this really bright light that I have jacked up on a like tripod, and it has a diffuser over the top of it, which basically breaks the light up so it's not so harsh. Instead of it feeling like a direct lamp with a flashlight effect, right, with the hard shadows, the diffuser over the front of it breaks up the light. Now, I bought a pack of 2 of these, just the cheapest thing that I could find on Amazon, and I think it was like $60 for 2 of them. I think having 2 is really great. You really only need 1 minimum, but 2 is really going to allow you to have some like interesting dynamic effects or just different lighting, right? One of the most common lighting setups that I see is people putting one from the front somewhere, right, either directly or from the side a little bit, and then one right behind so that you get this like, what do they call it? You get rim lighting along the edge, right? So that if it's dark over here, your subject doesn't just disappear into the dark background. You have this like rim, this little like edge of light that lights them up here. So having 2 lights, 2 studio lights, allows you to do something like that. For most of my photos that I take indoors, those are the things that I use the most often and probably were like the best bang for your buck that you can get. The other light that I have is this little direct light, and it is actually, it's supposed to be diffused, but it's actually like, it's actually not. It's super bright. It creates those like hard shadows like I talked about, right? You can kind of see it maybe. But mainly what I've used this for in the past is either like bouncing it off the wall when I needed a third light, or I have these little gel things to create like a lit effect. You probably can't see that though, it probably just looks like completely white in the camera. But yeah, so I've got a couple different of those. So that's mainly what I use this little light for. I think this was like $15 or $20, something like that. And I just have it like on another tripod, and I can bend it around, you know, depending on where the doll is and stuff like that. But mainly I just use this for putting the gels in front of it in order to like give a colored effect. And I'll try and take some more photos doing that so that you guys can see sort of what that looks like. That's okay. I don't recommend that. If you're like looking for one thing to get, I wouldn't get a third light or something like that to use with gels, unless you really want to try out some like creative stuff. I don't have a flash, so I don't use one. Do I plan on buying one? Not really. I like taking photos in natural light as much as possible. My preferred time is taking them at the end of the day, even before golden hour. But a lot of my photos in the past were taken in like trees or near trees or something like that, right? There's forested areas nearby, so I go out on the trail and sort of set her up so that there's enough like global light bouncing around, but there isn't anything direct, and I kind of like that natural look, so that's what most of my photos look like. So I don't use a flash, but you can find one or get one for, you know, your specific camera, or just use some kind of like direct light like this. Have a friend out there, and that kind of serves the purpose of the flash too. The other really helpful thing that you probably would invest in if you're serious about taking better photos is a diffuser / reflector. I used to have one of these things. I don't anymore. I thought it was just a ton of work when I used to do like photography for people, but they're a really good tool. So the diffuser reflector has two jobs, right? It has a reflective surface or a reflective like zip cover that you can put on, and they're normally like silver or gold, so you can get a warm light or just a cool white light. And the reflector, basically you'd put below your subject or on the side or wherever you needed to like fill that light, fill those shadows. You just put it around your subject, you know, and it would bounce that light up and fill those shadows. They're usually like these giant discs that are like at least 3 feet big, I think. Or about a meter big. But so it reflects light, and then if you take off that zip coating, you have the diffuser underneath, which just looks like a sort of like mesh net kind of, but it's really fine. And again, that's just for blocking direct light and removing those like harsh shadows. So outside of a studio light, if you're inside most of the time, if you like taking photos outside most of the time, I'd say the diffuser reflector is probably the best thing that you can buy to help make your photos better. It's going to cut away those really harsh shadows, and if you want to take photos in the shade or at night and still like light up the face, or maybe you're out somewhere and you just need a little bit more light and it's bright enough, the reflector is going to help you do that. So that's the other thing that I really recommend. And at least for lighting, I think that really sums up the tools that I use. Again, just really quick, indoor, I think the most helpful thing that you can use is like a studio light that has a diffuser on it. If you're outside, I think a reflector / diffuser is a really good investment too. The studio lights, I got a pack of 2 of them. It came with the poles and everything for $60. The reflector diffuser, I think, is somewhere in between $30 to $50, depending on like the quality and how big it is and things like that. So one of those 2 things is really good. If you don't feel like buying anything, or you're like super low on budget, the 2 best things that you can do are use some kind of external light you have, whether it's a flashlight or a lamp light or just something, and put like a parchment paper over it. Again, this is like super low budget. And then for the reflector, you know, just get a board like this that's like $1 at any kind of store. Just get a reflector like this at like Walmart, and that'll help you, you know, bounce light on your subject inside as well as outside too. I almost forgot this. So this is probably something that'll be really popular with a lot of you guys. Have you ever seen those photos where it's like dark and moody, or it's like cozy and they're like hanging out inside, and you know, it's a beautiful photo and it looks like there's like these fireflies hanging around your doll and stuff like that? How did they do that, right? They just get these string lights. That's all they are. They just get these string lights, And a big part of that is like aperture, to make sure that they're blurred out and you can't actually tell that it's a string, but we're not going to talk about it in this video. We'll talk about that in another one. But string lights like this, super helpful. You could use like Christmas lights too, if you have those, but these smaller ones are a little bit better, more discreet, and they bend too. But yeah, these string lights, I don't know, they're like $10, I think, at like any craft store or like a Walmart, you know, and then they just like put them around the doll for accenting. I think this is another really cool tool that you can use. I use this for my camping video and some of my camping photos I took, but that's another little thing you can use, and it creates a neat light effect. And I think that is pretty much everything. Again, this was like not super comprehensive, and we're just talking about light. In the next video, we'll talk about something else, but I think light is one of the most important aspects that you can't overlook when you're taking good photos of your doll. If you have anything else that you want to share with other people or that I left out, just put it in the comments below, and hopefully it'll help everybody that's watching this video. Lastly, it would really help me out if you guys would consider subscribing. I know a big chunk of you are not, and that's okay, but it really makes a difference to me and my channel if you do, especially if you like the video too. I appreciate it. But yeah, let me know what other videos you want to see. I'm trying to get more regular on putting them out again. And again, this will be a series, so there will be more videos on how to take better photos coming up soon. Thanks again for watching, guys. Me and Kanata will see you again soon.